small group discussions. It's about equal airtime for everyone at every table to express themselves. The first and third Sundays are speaker Sundays, where we have a much longer presentation and then a longer open mic for people to talk to the group. Do we have any newcomers? Okay. Announcements. You had an announcement.
Yes.
Jim?
I have to figure it out now.
While he's
You
doing
got to be really fast. Okay.
yeah.
My name is Jim Loren. I'm also a member of the board for the Humanists and the Free Thinkers. Pam is a member. I'm a member. We have Bill. We have Jim Bucko. We have Bo. And any other board members here? Anyway. So one of our board members is Mike Enright. He was one of the founding members of the club. And he is now living in assisted living down on Rainy Trail. And he is looking for volunteers. He wants to encourage the humanists to put our humanist hat on and help other humans to volunteer at his facility, which is just past Lakeside Landings. If you know where Lakeside Landings is on Rainy Trail, you go past it, you turn left, that's his place. So it's not far away. He's looking for folks who can do things like transfer residents in wheelchair, maybe read to the residents, present talks to, he started up, because he's Mike, started up a group kind of like this at his facility, teach music or art or anything else, talk to people, play cards or checkers. So if you'd like a volunteer opportunity, you can contact me or talk to me, and I'll give you this. There's an email address for Robin at the facility, and you can contact her, or you can, if you know Mike Enright, you can just contact Mike Enright directly. Thank you.
I just gave a talk at the assisted living, and if you have any interest in doing it, it's absolutely delightful. Occasionally somebody might fall asleep during the talk, but that comes with the territory. Very small group, it can be incredibly personal communication with everyone. So I strongly recommend it. I really enjoyed it. Upcoming meetings. Well, first let me ask though, that was an announcement. Do we have any more announcements or jokes or recommendations? Where are all the good jokes? Nobody. I'm going to give you a task. Let's try to bring some jokes. We need humor in our lives, especially now, I think.
Bo, you have an announcement, don't you? Are you speaking at Civil Discourse on Monday?
Oh, yes, that's right.
Tell them
I'm not, does this mean I have to show up?
If you're not familiar with Civil Discourse, it's kind of like this, but different.
That's right, much more regimented. In the sense that if you want to ask a question, you have to announce it in advance and wait till you're called on. No, it's actually fun. It's actually a table group discussion. I am doing, on last Monday, I gave my talk on healthcare in the United States and its comparison with that of countries to which we usually compare ourselves, and it's entitled Healthcare USA, System versus Industry, which do you prefer, and are you sure? That's being repeated up at, where am I talking? Tomorrow? Yeah, where?
At Savannah.
Oh, at Savannah, that's right. It was a colony this past Monday in Savannah at 10 a.m. You know better than to give me the mic, Jim. I can go on forever.
Take it back.
Wonderful discussion groups we have and talks we have. The groups that offer that are all listed online at the village's discussion groups. You can see who the upcoming speakers are, or maybe just explore a new club that you didn't even know existed up till then. Upcoming on December 15th, we have Jim Press speaking here at Humanist Club. I don't know if he's the one that gave a presentation on this topic that I went to before or not, but it's a really interesting topic, and I have no idea what had gone on after the Civil War. It's called The Lost Cause Mythology, a Southern Civil War narrative that was used to explain the defeat and to maintain racial control and white supremacy. It was huge. The group down south, I recall, a group of women started being the people to edit or decide what textbooks to accept. And if the textbooks had anything negative to say about the South or anything positive to say about the North during the Civil War, they were out. And for some reason, the entire nation let them then choose textbooks.
Just like today.
Just terrible. There will be no Humanist meetings the 22nd or 29th of December because it is the 4th and 5th meeting. Our sister club is Free Thinkers. It meets on Thursdays at 2:30, the second Thursday at 2:30 at Bridgeport, and the fourth Thursday at 3:30 at Aviary. Again, probably won't remember this, but you can check it out on Village's discussion groups. On December 12th, Peter Irwin is doing a repeat of a talk he did at Aviary. It will be at 2:30 at Bridgeport, and it's called Rationales for War. Today we're going to dip our toes into the Constitution. Wow, I watched several hours of videos. I got a book called Constitution for Dummies, and there is just so much information there that's so interesting. Yes?
I just wanted to know, I don't know if people know about the Salon series from Beacon College. I've been going regularly. It's free. It's by, Beacon College is a college for students with different learning styles. And they have a Salon series. And tomorrow night is a Ukrainian symphony of survival from the Holocaust to Putin's war. And they bring in lecturers every month, so I think people should check it out. They have a building right near Ski Beach on that lake in Leesburg. There's a restaurant. They have their own building where they do their presentations, and they're quite good.
And you get a free dinner.
The Salon series, and so we can look at
And
it
they provide food.
Yeah, free dinner.
I had heard about this, and I heard
It's really nice.
it's excellent.
Yeah, it's really
If
nice.
I may add on to that, it's at the Venetian Center
Right.
is the location.
Right.
And you should register for it, even though it is free.
Yeah.
They just want to get a head count for how much food they need to bring in. Again, the food is free. It's usually it has been a pasta meal.
Carrabba's.
Great.
Carrabba's, yes.
Pam, people can get to that site by Googling Beacon College Salon Series.
Okay, Beacon College.
And you can register on that site.
Thank you, Scott. Anyway, in my starting to just touch the information in the Constitution, I realized how fascinating it is and how little I know about it. So I'm not going to talk about it, but we are going to watch a video that, again, really just touches upon parts of it. And then, as per usual, we will have the small table discussion groups, and then open mic, and Aixa, where are you, Aixa? Right there. I think before you even knew this was going to be the topic, came up with a fabulous suggestion. She's going to lead trivia. She's taking the 100 questions from which 10 are drawn for each person seeking citizenship in order to pass the test. And she's gonna draw a few. If people are real interested, we can do more next time, because I know we're on a tight schedule today. Okay.
There is a great deal of talk today about the original intent of the writers of the Constitution. Now, no matter where one stands on that issue, it is important to realize that the writers of the Constitution did not foresee or plan to create the political system that we have today. That is, a democratic republic based upon two national and permanent political parties. Indeed, democracy and political parties were dirty words to them. Nor did the writers anticipate the economic system we have today or our social values. In many, if not most ways, the world they lived in was very different from the one we live in. They realized that their world was likely to change. That's one of the reasons they put into the Constitution the amendment process, which in turn is one of the major reasons this document has survived as our frame of government for so long, and despite all the changes in all aspects of American life. Now, to understand the world of the founders, we must first understand who they were, the problems they faced, and why they created this new frame of government. We also need to understand the historical controversies that have swirled around them and exactly what is in the document that they created. The public lack of knowledge of those contents is frightening. A survey conducted during the 1987 bicentennial showed 46% not knowing the original purpose of the Constitution. 26% thought it was to declare independence from England. 59% did not know what the Bill of Rights was. Only 41% correctly identified it as the first 10 amendments. 27% thought it was the preamble to the Constitution. And a frightening 49% erroneously thought the president could suspend the Constitution. Let's begin with the world of 1787 and the ensuing historical controversies. The Constitution was not the original frame of government of the newly independent United States. The states originally were governed by the Second Continental Congress, and then from 1781 to 1789 by the Articles of Confederation. Now, late 19th century historians saw these articles as a disastrous failure, and indeed called this time period the critical period, where an infant and endangered United States was saved by the godlike founding fathers. That interpretation was stood on its head in the early 20th century by historians such as Charles Beard, who argued that it was not a critical period, but that its democratic thrust alienated the moderates of the previous decade, the revolutionary decade, who had become reluctant revolutionaries. Motivated by economic and class interests, they responded with the Constitution as an anti-democratic, counter-revolutionary document in an effort to protect those interests. Now, that interpretation itself then came under attack in the mid and late 20th century. This, as we will see in later lectures, is part of the ongoing process of historical interpretation and reinterpretation. For now, let me just note that many historians today view the Constitution as a continuation of the Revolution, not the antithesis of the Revolution. Also, the issue is far from settled, and it is unlikely ever to be settled. For historical interpretations, again, as we will explore in later lectures, are constantly being affected and revised by present-day concerns. My interpretation that follows will thus reflect contemporary scholarship and contemporary issues and values. Now, the process of creating governments began in the 1770s as the colonial assemblies transformed themselves into state legislatures and governments. This process would involve a series of major departures from British practice, reflecting colonial experiences. For example, the colonists rejected the British concept of balanced government in favor of overwhelming legislative power. The colonial governors and judges had been royal appointees and had been perceived as tyrannical. In the Articles of Confederation period, their powers were extremely limited within each state. You also had a move to written constitutions within each state instead of unwritten constitutions. This was due to the perceived failure of the unwritten British Constitution to protect liberty. You also had an old tradition in colonial history of written charters in the founding of many colonies. State assemblies became more representative due to the logic of the revolution, as I explained in the last lecture, with the franchise extended and frequent elections. The central government, at first, was the Second Continental Congress, which was obviously makeshift, and it was replaced by the Articles of Confederation, which were presented to the states in 1777, but not ratified by all the states until 1781. Why? The states retained their distrust of any centralized power. That's what they were fighting against. And they also retained their distrust of each other. There had been no history of cooperation before the Revolution, and the cooperation that existed during the revolutionary period had been quite limited and broke down once the revolution ended. Smaller states fear larger ones, especially those with Western land claims, for fear that they, the small states, would lose their population to larger states that could avoid taxing by simply using land sales to run the government. Maryland, for example, refused to ratify the Articles of Confederation unless state Western land claims were given to the national government. Virginia and other states agreed in order to get a central government, and because they believed that a Republican form of government could not work in large areas. This is something I'll get to later. Now, the Articles did set up a central government of sorts, but a very weak one. There was no executive, no judiciary, only a Congress with no power to tax or to do anything important without a vote of 9 out of the 13 states. Nor could they change the structure without a unanimous vote in favor of changing it. Each state had one vote, and thus a virtual veto power. This had all been done very consciously. The states saw themselves as independent republics, retaining sovereignty and joining into a loose confederation, similar to today's United Nations. This came from their colonial past, in addition to their fear of centralized power from the revolutionary era. Liberty was now to be guaranteed by decentralization and by state legislatures. Now, despite the inherent weaknesses obvious of this frame of government, much was actually accomplished under the Articles. The winning of independence and the obtaining of a favorable peace treaty in 1783 with a western boundary all the way to the Mississippi River. The establishment of state governments with many social and political reforms. The lowering of property qualifications for voting to extend the franchise. Frequent elections. Separation of church and state. Beginning of the abolition of slavery in northern states. Expansion of education and literacy, and the creation of state bills of rights. You also established the pattern for Western expansion and settlement with the Northwest Ordinances of 1784, 85, and 87. All Western land north of the Ohio River that had been given up by the states to the national government was to be surveyed, divided, and sold in 640-acre lots for $1 per acre. Eventually, there would be self-rule and admission to the Union as anywhere from 3 to 5 new states on an equal basis when the population had reached 60,000. There were also guarantees of freedom of worship, trial by jury, and there was to be no slavery in this entire territory. Internationally, trade was opened with the European powers under the Articles of Confederation and with Asia. And loans were extended to the United States. But the problems under the Articles appeared to many to outweigh these successes by 1787, and those problems were both external and domestic. The Confederation Congress had no power to tax, and thus no power to pay for an armed force or to pay its debts. After the Revolution, the Navy was sold. At one point, the Army was down to 80 men. Rather than a national army, reliance was placed on untrained and unreliable state militia. Now, this lack of military power, lack of power to tax, translated into no power in foreign affairs and no respect from the European powers. The British locked the United States out of their mercantilist trading system. They also violated the peace treaty by refusing to leave their posts in the Northwest, and they supported, in fact incited, Indian resistance from those posts to American settlers. Nor was that the end of it. Spain refused to agree to the southern U.S. boundary with Florida and denied the United States the right to navigate the Mississippi River and the right of deposit at New Orleans. It also incited secessionist movements in the Southwest. Internally, there is a post-war economic depression blamed on the Articles. People in each state demand relief. The easiest way to obtain relief is to stop foreclosures on land for non-payment of debts, to repudiate debts, and or to print paper money so as to create inflation, which will make repayment of debts much easier. That is easy to do since there's little or no check on legislative powers in each state. And creditors and men of property complain that the state governments are breaking the social contract by doing this, and that this is, as we would say today, democracy run amok. States are establishing their own currencies and trading systems. There is a breakdown in interstate relations with the looming danger of states turning to European allies and thus opening the door to European intervention, manipulation, and control. By 1786-87, there is fear of anarchy with Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts. Daniel Shays, Revolutionary War hero, led a march of 1,200 on the courts to stop foreclosures and then on the Springfield Arsenal to obtain weapons. There was no national army to stop this. The state militia did, but they could just as easily have failed due to lack of training or even joined Shays' men. And after Shays' defeat, his followers were elected to office and stopped foreclosures anyway. What all of this illustrated was the weakness of both the state governments and the national government. Now, all of this convinced many that the present national government was incapable of defending the liberty won during the Revolution and that a new frame of government was necessary. What you have here, one needs to realize, is an elite definition of liberty. It is not democracy at all. It is individual freedom from tyranny or from any form of external control or interference. But, by the political thought of the day, such tyranny or control could come from above or from below, from mob rule that broke the social contract. John Randolph of Virginia, I think, summed this up best in his famous quote, "I am an aristocrat. I love liberty. I hate equality." Now, while the revolution has fought successfully for liberty and against tyranny from above, liberty to these men is now threatened by tyranny from below. Simultaneously, it is once again threatened by tyranny from above as well, the danger of European intervention and the destruction of the entire Republican experiment. More centralized power is thus perceived as necessary to fend off the Europeans and their tyranny from above and the tyranny from below that would come from democratic mob rule. By 1786, those who think this way find support amongst the middle and lower classes as well as the upper classes. Creditors, of course, merchants and shippers who want a national commercial policy and power to break into the European mercantilist trading systems. Artisans who want a high national tariff. Westerners who want defense against the Indians, the British, and the Spanish. Land speculators wanting the same, as well as protection from squatters. In 1786, representatives from 5 states met in Annapolis and asked Congress to call a special convention to revise and strengthen the Articles of Confederation. That would lead to the Constitutional Convention. 55 men from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia from May to September 1787. Well, who are they? It's interesting to note who is not in Philadelphia. Such revolutionary radicals as Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, Thomas Jefferson, they are not there. The revolutionary leaders Franklin and Washington are present. But aside from these 2 venerable figures, most of the delegates are quite young. James Madison and Gouverneur Morris are only 35. Rufus King and Alexander Hamilton are only 32. Charles Pinckney is only 29. Almost all had continental as opposed to state experiences during the Revolutionary War. Many were veterans of Washington's Continental Army or the Continental Congress, and that experience gave them a national as opposed to a state outlook. At least one historian has labeled them the first true Americans. Now, are they conservative or revolutionary? They are simultaneously both. They are conservative as men of property who fear democracy and mob rule as destructive of liberty. They are elitist Republicans, if you will, rather than democratic Republicans. But simultaneously, they are revolutionary in their desire to create something new, a large republic with centralized power that preserves liberty rather than destroying it. One needs to understand that this contradicts established political thought and experience. That established political thought and experience held that republics only worked in small areas and that large, centralized nations were best ruled by absolute monarchs. The founders would turn this on its head. And what you get here, one might argue, is a concept of creating an empire of liberty. The men who gather in Philadelphia were also willing to ignore their instructions to revise and amend the Articles of Confederation, and instead they decided to come up with an entirely new frame of government, one that they devised in secret sessions with locked doors and windows, despite the summer heat. One can argue that in some ways what you had here was a coup. The basic dilemma: how do you create a government strong enough to preserve liberty from tyranny of the mob and/or from the European monarchs without giving it enough power to be tyrannical itself? This dilemma was best expressed by the father of the Constitution, James Madison, later when he wrote the 51st Federalist Paper. If men were angels, Madison wrote, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is, Madison continued, no doubt the primary control on government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. The Constitution thus begins with "we the people." Sovereignty rests with the people. But the document then separates sovereignty from rule via a series of intermediaries, and it divides power between those intermediaries so as to avoid tyranny. We know the system is checks and balances, and it exists on 2 levels: the separation of powers between the 3 branches of the new national government, and the division of powers between that new national government and the existing state governments. Let's look at the separation of powers first. The founders returned to the concept of balanced government due to the perceived excesses and weaknesses of the existing legislative governments. What they decided to do was to combine elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy within the new national government. Let's look at the president. The president is a monarch, the executive power, but one indirectly elected via the Electoral College. And it was perceived at that time that the electors in the Electoral College would be the aristocrats. Furthermore, the president's term is limited to 4 years, and the powers of the presidency are limited to those enumerated in Article 2 of the Constitution. The Senate is an aristocratic branch of government. It is not directly elected by the people, not in the original Constitution. You needed a constitutional amendment to change that. It is done via the state legislatures. One might argue that the people elect senators indirectly. They vote for their betters in the state legislatures, and the state legislatures determine who will be the senators. The term is lengthy, 6 years, with the powers listed in Article 1 of the Constitution. The national judiciary is also aristocratic. The Democratic branch is to be the House of Representatives, with short terms, frequent elections, but still you have property qualifications for voting. The theory at the time was that you had to have a stake in society in order to be able to vote. Each branch had the power to check the other branches. For example, the president is the commander-in-chief, but Congress appropriates funds for the armed forces and declares war. The president makes judicial and diplomatic appointments and negotiates treaties, but with the, quote, advice and consent of the Senate and appropriations approved by both houses. Congress makes the laws, but the president can veto them, and the Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 vote. So much for the separation of powers. What about the division of powers? The new national government has enormous power, but does not have a monopoly on power. It is to be shared with the existing state governments, and that is explicitly reaffirmed in the 10th Amendment, which states that all powers not delegated to the new national government or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states, so that the states can be capable of checking the national government, as the national government can be capable of checking the excesses of the state. Some powers are very clearly shared. State militia are controlled by the state governments unless called into service by the president, to active service for the national government by the president. The document sets up a very large republic. And as I pointed out before, in theory, by political theory of the day, it cannot survive. Madison, in the 10th Federalist paper, turns this established political theory on its head. He claims that a republic in a large area has a better chance of preserving liberty than a republic in a small area. And in the process, he explains the logic behind the entire system. Madison defines factions as the key problem, and factions as a minority or a majority willing to ride roughshod over the rights of others to ensure its own interests. In democracies, a majority faction can easily gain control and destroy liberty. Now, Madison insists that such factions cannot be abolished without abolishing liberty. They are inherent in human nature. The key is to control them, and that is to be done via checks and balances. Madison then argues that a large republic can do this better than small republics because the greater the population and area, the more factions will exist, and thus the less chance of one faction dominating over the others. As Madison noted in this regard, a major difference between a republic and a democracy was the greater number of citizens and the extent of territory that could exist under a Republican government. The smaller the society, Madison wrote, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party, and the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. That's for small democratic society. As for republics, extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Now, despite agreement on such essentials, disagreements among the delegates almost wreck the convention. Major disputes pit large against small states, northern against southern states. Delegates also split over just how much power to give to the national government at the expense of the states. The large versus small state dispute focuses on representation in Congress. Madison's Virginia plan had called for representation in both houses of Congress to be based on population. Small states like New Jersey refused to agree. The result was the so-called Great Compromise. The House of Representatives would be based on population, but there would be equal representation for all states in the Senate. There is also a split between the commercial and urban North, as opposed to the agrarian and slaveholding South. That split was already apparent, and it led to a series of compromises. There would never be an export tax, because the South produced a cash crop. There would be no ban on the slave trade for 20 years. A 2/3 vote would be needed in the Senate on all treaties, and a slave was to count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. Now, some delegates feared that despite the checks and balances, this new national government had too much power. Only 39 of the 55 who were in attendance signed the final document. But the majority believed they had come up with something superior and unique, a large, centralized republic capable of acting strongly while preserving liberty. But will their fellow citizens agree? The document called for special state ratifying conventions in each state, with 9 states needed to put the document into effect. Intense opposition emerged in virtually every state, primarily from established groups who control state governments and fear such centralized power. The result would be a major struggle in each state. It was very close, especially in the critical states of Virginia and New York. The Federalist Papers, I quoted, were written not only by Madison, but also by Alexander Hamilton and John Jay in an effort to convince New York voters to accept the Constitution. The pro-Constitution forces won for a host of reasons. They were better organized, they were on the offensive, and they had the advantage of defining themselves as Federalists. Really, they were nationalists. But by taking the title Federalists, what could their opponents call themselves? Anti-Federalists? That was quite a negative connotation. Also, the call for ratification via state conventions, special state conventions, meant that the state legislatures, which had a vested interest in the failure of the new system, would be bypassed. Furthermore, the Federalists agreed to a key anti-Federalist objection, the lack of any specific Bill of Rights. They agreed to create one as their first order of business under the new government. The result would be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. North Carolina and Rhode Island did not agree until 1790-91, but the rest did agree early enough for the new government to begin functioning in 1789. So what do we have here? The final document in the Federalist Papers show the founders as Hobbesian realists who distrusted human nature and who sought to stop what they considered the excesses of the Revolution. In that sense, they could be considered conservative and even counter-revolutionary. Simultaneously, however, they are still Lockeans and revolutionaries who wish to preserve their Republican experiment against what they consider clear and present dangers. And they are willing to try a radical, unprecedented experiment to do so. The only analogy they have for a large republic is Rome, and that is not a very reassuring one. They see their Constitution as fulfilling, not negating, the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, a way to make republicanism work and thereby allow liberty to thrive. Now, they succeed in establishing a new frame of government, but in the process, they left a series of unanswered questions for the future. Is this a union of the people, as the House shows, or of the states, as the Senate shows? What is the proper balance between state and national power? How can you have a Republican empire of liberty when that liberty is based on the enslavement of others? Counting slaves as 3/5 of a human being does not really answer that question. And can you really have an empire of liberty, a large expanding nation, run by a central government powerful enough to retain domestic order and military security without creating a tyranny from above? Within a few years, the writers of this document will split on their answers to these questions. They will fail to resolve them in their lifetimes. They will change the system they created in trying to solve them, and they will bequeath those problems to their successors. And while some of those problems would be resolved in the 19th century, be it by compromise or by civil war, others remain central to our political discourse throughout the 20th century and still today. Most notably, the proper balance between state and national power. And some would argue whether it is indeed possible to have an empire of liberty.
Approach. We're going to move into our small table group discussions, and I always like to start with reminding people what our mission here is on Social Sundays. There are many opportunities in the villages for those who are extremely knowledgeable and extremely self-confident in speaking. The mission for this kind of get-together is to empower the others at your table to have a voice. So I ask those, you all know who you are, that have endless knowledge. Don't use this as a teaching opportunity. Don't dominate the conversation. Instead, support me by only taking equal airtime to everybody else at your table and using your energies not as much to talk, but to help draw other people out in their thinking and in their expressing themselves. So we start with going around a circle. Everyone take up to 2 minutes to respond to the video. And then we open the table up, but again, it's only 2 minutes at a time. Anyone who has not tended to express themselves, we use the jump rule. They get to speak rather than people who've already taken advantage of their opportunity many times. And just remember, the goal is equal airtime. If you don't have something you'd like to share just as a response to this video, I usually have questions, but there are just so many things this brings up. One thing it doesn't mention is the spectrum now of originalists, people who believe that the Constitution is fixed and binding. It's a little tough because things have sure changed, but they have some points. And then there are people who believe that they're living constitutionalists, that the Constitution needs to evolve in response to changing values and circumstances. I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. You might ask yourself, yes, it has to evolve, but when might that go too fast or go too far? So, go at it.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Darren. Please wind up your discussions. We're going to move right into passing the mic. For those who might want to share something with the whole group, we're going to make it brief though. Please try to be concise. And Jim's going to run that. Why don't you just...
Is there a question to kick off? This is on, yeah. Who would like to start? Who would like to have a conversation? Nobody. All right. So we hear we hear all the time about this particular case is going to the Supreme Court. That case is going to the Supreme Court. What's your feeling about how the members of the Supreme Court interpret the Constitution?
Yeah, I wasn't to speak. We didn't mention that. We just covered a smattering of all the topics, but we did, 5 of the 6 of us believe that whatever we're doing is pretty well broken now, and it needs some kind of repair. As far as the courts, I didn't take account, but I think most of us believe that they're biased now.
So go deeper into it's broken. It's broken meaning it should be going this way, but it's going that way. What are those 2 directions that it's going?
It's gaming instead of governing, and partisanship, and too much influence with money and corporations, and too uninformed or stupid voters.
So you think that money and corporations are affecting the decisions of the Supreme Court, or some other?
No, I mean,
there's politics and lots of politics. Let's stick to the Constitution. How is money and corporations affecting the Constitution or the interpretation?
Well, if you want to say,
I know what money.
if money and corporations influence who's elected positions, who appoint the people of the Supreme Court, then you could say indirectly it's doing it.
Okay. Anyone else? Scott, Scott, this sounds like something you would have an opinion on.
I can say something.
I know, I knew you would.
One has to say that there's a lot of talk about is the Constitution a living document, or you have to look to original intent. My own view is that you really need to look to original intent in general terms. Otherwise, the Constitution is meaningless, and the Supreme Court decides whatever it wants to decide based on their political views. And that doesn't mean that you have to interpret the Constitution strictly according to its verbiage, but you would look at the philosophical purpose of the various provisions. What kind of goal were the drafters trying to attain when they included certain provisions?
So I know, Jim Bucko, what's that quote that you put on the end of your emails about the interpretation of the Bible?
One does not derive their moral positions from Scripture. One inserts their moral decisions
into the Scripture. Could the same thing happen with the Constitution?
Of course.
So in other words, you see in it what you want to see in it in some cases, and our judges, our Supreme Court judges, I'm sure, are not immune to that either.
So my personal opinion is that the Constitution is a living document, and the founders made it that way because they allowed amendments to the Constitution.
And that's true, and amendments are very difficult to insert, as we know from like the Equal Rights Amendment, which still to this very day is rattling around the various states. They're trying there's, I think, one state left to hit the threshold. But they've hit it. Oh, so they hit it. But the problem is that, so they didn't quite hit it. But the time period allowed has expired, right? So
There's
in other
a
words,
question as to whether they're allowed to have a time period.
right. So, or can they kick off a new one and start the time period again? Anyway,
Lots of litigation.
amendments are very difficult to do. They take many years just to do one, and this one is kind of way beyond its expiration date. But the world changes much faster than that, and we know just in 20, 30 years how much it's changed. So
You already made my point.
oh, okay. You know what? It'd be cool to do a case study to just take one case, whether it be something really controversial like Roe v. Wade or the Overture case or whatever, and none of us are constitutional scholars in here, but Bo could pretend to be one, probably, if you wanted to. And look at how especially Roe v. Wade, how it was originally interpreted and then how it was interpreted in the most recent court. And study the difference in the wording and how they, invalidate.
Where's Bill Sayer when you need him?
Yeah, Bill Sayer would be a good one. So, do you want to move on to the next?
Let's go ahead and move on, Alexa. You're on.
Oh, trivia time?
Yeah.
Okay.
We only have 15 more minutes.
You want to come up?
So we have time for about 10 questions.
10 questions and 20 answers.
Yeah.
Is this, are you smarter than a 6th grader civics student time? Recently, I was back up north with my son, and the Washington Post had, "Are you smarter than 8th grade civics student?" And I passed. He did not.
Okay. This is supposed to be the trivia question section of our program, although the questions that I'm going to ask are really not trivia. These are questions that are from the test that people that apply for citizenship have to take before they're awarded citizenship. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that process. During the days of COVID, I had the opportunity to work with two people who, this was in Asheville when we did everything remote, and these are two people that were getting tutoring from the Literacy Council in Asheville, and they asked me to work with these two people who were studying for the test. Part of the application process for citizenship, besides filling out a 12-page application and undergoing background tests, is to take a test. This is the final stage. You take a test, I believe, with an employee of the USCIS, United States Customs and Immigration Service. And there's a pool of 100 questions that you have to study and be able to answer. But of course, you'll only be asked 10 of them. And you would be asked them, usually it's verbally. And so I'm taking these trivia questions that are not really trivia from that. And if you ever want to know what the questions are, again, go to the USCIS.gov website and you'll find them there. So the first question is, let's see.
Would you like us to raise our hand if we know?
No,
No, you put it down on your sheet.
neither. You write it down.
table.
Table is
Write it down, and then you can.
Come on, take one.
Yeah, look it out. Okay, under the Constitution, under our Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one power of the states? Under the Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one of those powers?
income taxes.
There are several. National one. Do you want me to go ahead and ask all the questions?
Been 6 years.
Okay, so here's the next one. Under the Constitution, some powers belong to the federal government. What is one of those powers?
Yes, several were mentioned just in this video.
National defense.
Okay, the next one is, are you ready? Okay. What are two cabinet level positions? Two cabinet level positions. Okay. Might change.
It has to be in the well, the state. Treasury. Indian Affairs. We really aced that.
Another question. What does the president's cabinet do?
Hold positions.
Yeah. Well, education is actually not big on what's the cabinet? What's the cabinet?
We elect U.S. Senator for how many years? We elect a U.S. Senator for how many years? What is the term of office? How many years?
She is on the answer.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Hey, you're at our table, so we're going to use your answers.
Right. Okay. How many amendments does the Constitution have?
Can I get yeah, I know it's like 20.
Next one is. What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? provided one right for freedom from the First Amendment. One right for freedom from the First Amendment. One. There are many, there are several, just one. Just name one.
No, that's original. Okay, let's move on. How many did we have?
That was number 8.
Yeah.
8?
You want
We
some?
better go ahead. We can go another time.
The first one was under the Constitution. Some powers belong to the state. What is one power of the state? I mean, there are several, but what did this table come up with?
We had intrastate commerce within the state. And military, the ability to create a state military.
Other tables? Other answers?
Rules for conduction of elections.
Okay, what else?
We didn't really answer the question. No, I guess not.
Anyone else have an
Is
answer?
that in those are things, property to the state?
Okay, I'll assume you have one of the ones that were just mentioned. Can you have one?
You might have to report some of these guys.
How about police?
Here, these are the acceptable answers according to USCIS. This was about the powers of the state. Provide schooling and education. Provide protection. Provide, that refers to the police, provide safety. That seems to refer to the fire department. Give a driver's license and approve zoning and land use.
If you got one of those, you get a point.
The next question was, under the Constitution, what powers belong to the federal government? What did you come up with?
Taxation.
Make treaties,
Declare war.
Declare war.
Okay.
That's what we put. Declare war.
Yeah.
That's all subsequent stuff.
Currency.
Any other of the answers that are listed here under the Constitution? Powers belong to the federal government to print money, to declare war, to create an army, to make treaties. Remember this, under the Constitution. Okay. The next question has to do with cabinet level positions. What are 2 cabinet level positions today?
We have state and defense.
Any others? Last table, you have anything?
Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Interior,
But I'll pull up the answers that the USCIS will accept. Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Defense, Education, Energy, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, Secretary of Interior, Labor, State, Transportation, Treasury, Veterans Affairs, Attorney General, Vice President. Cabinet level position. It doesn't say, it doesn't ask for provided by the Constitution. It doesn't say that. I just need to know. As I said, doesn't necessarily refer to the Constitution.
They didn't exist.
Okay, so the next question. What does the President's Cabinet do?
Now?
Advise the President. Advisor to the President. Anybody has anything different?
Right near the clock.
Pardon?
Right near the clock. Right near the clock.
Well, the only acceptable answer for this test is this one. Yeah. So, I mean, you got to test for it.
President, but that's, de facto, that's not what they actually do.
We elect a U.S. Senator for how many years? What is the term of office?
100.
In some cases, it worked out that way. 6 years. What are true rights in the Declaration of Independence? You didn't ask that one?
You mean in the First Amendment? You asked for two rights in the First Amendment.
Two rights in the First Amendment. Oh, I'm sorry. I said that. Okay. What are true rights in the First Amendment?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of assembly.
Speech, religion, assembly, freedom of the press, and petition the government. And I was to recall the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Bill of Rights. And let's see this last one, I see.
What about number 6?
How many amendments?
How many amendments?
How many amendments?
10.
Amendments.
Well, 27
Amendments to
10
the
in the
Constitution.
Constitution.
How many amendments do we have in our Constitution?
27.
27.
Is that the one that was canceled?
They're still there. They're not removed.
Yeah, it's double, going in and out.
Okay. How about a hand for Aisha? Stepping up and bringing forward. Thank you so much. Okay, so 8 questions. It's not too tough. How many got 5 correct? Come on, guys. 5 going once, going twice. Okay, how many got 6? 6? 7? And 8? Oh, you could be a citizen. Okay, thanks everybody for coming. Have a lot of fun.